Welcome. I'm Tita Chico, Professor of English and Faculty Director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. We are very delighted to host this program today, prompted by a conversation about writing and authorship prompted by artificial intelligence. My many thanks to the generous, capacious, and invigorating thinking of my colleagues for being prompted to develop this conversation. And my thanks too, as always, to Dr. Karen Nelson for her work on the logistics that enable us to gather today. At the center, we commit to making our events accessible. Today's conversation will be accompanied by live captioning provided by Katie, Julie, and Jenny Newbury. Thank you very much, Katie and Jenny. The transcript is available here, which you'll see in the chat right now. A few words as we begin. Our topic circles around artificial intelligence, and we also gather together virtually with registrants from across the globe. But our work, our institutional home, our technologies, ourselves, all of these are grounded in ways that can be all too easy to forget. Extractive colonial practices of lithium mining in the global south fuel so-called clean technologies in our electric cars. Mobile phones, they use, among many minerals, cobalt. Half of the world's supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, some of it extracted through child labor. My point is this: we are grounded just as we are virtual. Land, capaciously understood, makes possible ourselves and our technologies. And this is the framing I evoke to turn to the recent yet very modest measures the University of Maryland has taken to recognize the indigenous history of these lands upon which the campus is built in modern-day College Park in Prince George's County, a county that's named for the husband of 18th century British Queen Anne. The university rests upon the original homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribal nations, itself a 19th century institution built through wealth extracted from enslaved Black men, women, and children, with trustees who were slavocrats. The university in these recent years has developed a land acknowledgement and has named a new dining hall a word in Algonquin, meaning a place to go to eat. But as a recent op-ed in the student newspaper by Lee Danielle Escobar argues, these modest measures are performative and lacking unless they are accompanied by substantive actions. As Robin Wall Kimmerer, a botanist and a member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, as she teaches us, the plant sweetgrass gives us a way to think about these histories, these lands, these futures, these technologies. Sweetgrass, she writes, is passed from hand to earth to hand across years and generations. Sweetgrass, she tells us, thrives along disturbed edges. Today, among many other things, we will think capaciously about what thrives along disturbed edges. Prompted by a conversation about writing and authorship, prompted by artificial intelligence, will be moderated by my colleague Scott Trudell, Associate Professor of English and Director of Graduate Studies. Please join me in welcoming him as he introduces the panel. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Professor Chico. And actually, it's undergraduate studies, which is one way into this conversation, but not the only. The occasion for this conversation is the new prominence and availability of large language models, or LLMs, that predict plausible word sequences in response to a prompt, with ChatGPT as the most widely known example. Much of the discourse on this topic has taken the form of concern about student malfeasance, and that concern is real. We're already starting to see plagiarism cases, but this is only one dimension of this issue. And as witnessed by the approximately 400-person registration for this event, there is a need for broader thinking about the context and implications of this technology. By which I mean not only the biases that LLMs reproduce, or the massive amounts of carbon that they burn, but how they're starting to impact the media and cultural history of writing. The goal of this event is to take a moment to reflect on LLMs, writing, and authorship from the disciplinary perspectives of our speakers in media and textual theory, creative writing, digital humanities, and writing studies. These fields are not new to the question of how writing is shaped by technology and media. And I've been looking forward to learning from my colleagues' depth of knowledge in these areas. But I want to stress that they're only speaking for 10 minutes each. Their reflections may be informal or preliminary, and none of them has promised or claimed to be our ChatGPT oracle. As Professor Chico mentioned, this event is being recorded and will be made publicly available. Katie Dooley and Jenny Newbury are providing live captioning and transcriptions. After the speakers present their 10-minute reflections, I will ask them if they have any thoughts to share with each other, and then we will have a Q&A period. In preparation for that, please locate the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This is a separate option from the chat feature. And I will focus on the Q&A when it comes to conveying questions to the panel. So I'm now going to provide very brief introductions of the speakers in the order in which they will present so that we can get straight to the conversation. Matthew Kirschenbaum is Professor of English and Digital Studies and affiliate faculty with the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. He's also a member of the teaching faculty at the University of Virginia's Rare Book School. His publications include Bit Streams, The Future of Digital Literary Heritage, Track Changes, A Literary History of Word Processing, Zones of Control, Perspectives on Wargaming, which he co-edited with Pat Harrigan, and Mechanisms, New Media and the Forensic Imagination. Lillian-Yvonne Bertram is Visiting Associate Professor of English and Director of the MFA program in Creative Writing at the University of Maryland. And they direct the Chautauqua Institution Writers Festival. They are the author of the forthcoming poetry collection, Negative Money. They are also the author of Travesty Generator, Personal Science, A Slice from the Cake Made of Air, But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise, the chapbook Cutthroat Glamours, the artist book Grand Descent, and the Spanish chapbook Tierra Fisurada. Marissa Parham is Professor of English and Digital Studies at the University of Maryland and serves as Director for the African American Digital Humanities Initiative and as Associate Director for the Maryland Institute for Technology in the Humanities. She also co-directs the Immersive Realities Lab for the Humanities. Professor Parham's publications include the recent essay, Sample, Signal, Strobe, Haunting, Social Media, and Black Digitality, and digital interactive scholarly work, including Breaking, Dancing, Making in the Machine, and Dot Break, Dot Dance. She is the author of Haunting and Displacement in African American Literature and Culture, the Princeton Review's African American Student's Guide to College, and Theorizing Glissant, Sites and Citations, which she co-edited with John Drabinski. Jessica Enoch is Professor of English, Director of the Academic Writing Program, and affiliate faculty in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland. Professor Enoch's publications include Domestic Occupations, Spatial Rhetorics, and Women's Work, and with Cristina Ramirez, the bilingual critical anthology Mestiza Rhetorics, an anthology of Mexicana activism in the Spanish language press, 1887 to 1922. She is also the author of Refiguring Rhetorical Education, Women Teaching African American, Native American, and Chicano-Chicana Students, Retellings, Opportunities for Feminist Research in Rhetoric and Composition Studies, which was co-edited with Jordan Jack, and Women at Work, Rhetorics of Gender and Labor, which was co-edited with David Gold. Professor Kirschenbaum will begin.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. And thanks to my colleagues, Tita Chico and Karen Nelson as well for all of their help in getting us organized. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Thank you. Thanks to everybody out in the audience for taking some time for this conversation this afternoon. So just to follow on Scott's remarks just now, a big part of my own interest in participating and helping to organize this event is really the opportunity to think about writing as a medial category, that is writing and text as forms of media and content on the open web. So what I'm going to be doing today is sketching a scenario, and it's admittedly perhaps an extreme scenario, but it's also very much an extrapolation from past precedent and current trends. And so this is the scenario that I am calling Textpocalypse. And I want to begin with this question. What is the political economy of text? I don't believe we can really think through ChatGPT and the implications of other large language models without addressing this question. What is the political economy of text now? And by which I specifically mean text online, in other words, .txt, if you will. And so the first part of my response to that particular prompt is that text is data. And to the kind of generative AI we're seeing right now, text is not something to be read. It's data, which is to say a bit stream, a torrent unmoored from any embodied context. It's essence residing in the stochastic tumble of statistical weights between each character token and the next. An individual token or letter or character has meaning and value only ever as it falls forward, leaning domino-like into the one following, molding itself as it does to the probabilistic profile of whatever comes next. And so what does that mean in practice? This is a screenshot of a raw data dump provided to me by Tyler Schumacher at UC Davis. So thank you, Tyler, if you're out there in the audience. It's a swatch of internet text, many, many thousands of lines long, used as part of the training set for a language model. And if you just scan through it, you'll see all manner of everything from licensing, from advertisements for construction companies and travel agencies to code snippets, licensing agreements, terms of service statements, and so on and so forth. So what is the political economy of text right now? Text is data. Text is also content. Content as a specific internet category, writing, but also music, video, images, all media forms and formats optimized for circulation, and thereby also with the potential to be tapped, activated as revenue streams. The person who actually first talked about content in these particular terms actually turns out to be William Safire in the late 1990s, wrote a column about the new category of content online. This tweet popped into my feed a couple of weeks ago. I think it's a good example. Alex Hurd is the current editorial director of a magazine called Outside, devoted, it's not a magazine I would typically read. I don't know why it was in my feed, but devoted to the outdoor life, all things sort of sporty. And he you know, this is very typical of Twitter. There's nothing really remarkable about this combination of self-deprecation and humble brag, but he writes, an emergency need arose for someone to write 300 words of allegedly funny stuff for an issue of Outside magazine we're closing. I banged it out on the chiclet keys of I bashed it out on the chiclet keys of my laptop during the first half of the Super Bowl while drinking a beer. Surely this is my finest hour. And so John Guillory, who has been much a part of the discourse of late, in 2004 for Critical Inquiry, wrote an article on the memo and modernity, where he makes the point, and I think we all recognize this, that the vast majority of what gets written by us as people, it's not belletristic, it's not scholarly essays, it's things like memos, like interoffice memos, forms, reports. This vast swath of writing, what Guillory terms informational genres, is where I think we're going to see the language models first take hold, and indeed they already are. Many of you will remember this grotesque episode from a couple of weeks back where an office on the Vanderbilt University campus used ChatGPT and openly credited authorship to it as part of a campus-wide email responding to the mass shootings and killings at Michigan State University. And for me, this is of course abominable, but it's not abominable because of ChatGPT, which was only a means to an end. It was abominable because it exposed the logic of a certain kind of institutional and institutionalized writing, where the performative gesture of writing becomes a form of surrogate affect. So text is data, text is also content. And so this brings me to the textpocalypse scenario, where essentially we combine text, the status of text as data, its status as content, with also now automation. OpenAI, which is the San Francisco-based company originally co-founded by Elon Musk that's responsible for ChatGPT, last week released what's called the API, the Application Programming Interface for ChatGPT. Suffice, this is essentially the code base that will allow developers to integrate ChatGPT into websites and web services. And so in my scenario, we begin with APIs enabling large language models like ChatGPT to post directly to the open internet. We also recognize, as has been happening for some years now, that these language models, quote unquote, learn from text scraped off of the open internet. This is what we saw in the screenshot from Tyler Schumacher. And so you have that feedback loop. And then we also, I don't think it's difficult to imagine language models also prompting one another, essentially removing a human being from the loop, as it were. And in fact, this scenario has already played out last year in June 2022 on a small scale when an individual used an earlier version of GPT to create a small ecosystem of bots that began posting regularly to the POL, the politically incorrect forum on 4chan. And I just have a 20-second snippet here that I'm going to play for you.
I trained an AI language model on 3 years worth of 4chan posts. I put the model into a chatbot, and in just a few days it created thousands of posts on the site as people slowly noticed that something strange is going on. I released the model, the code, and I evaluated the model on a huge set of benchmarks, and it turns out this horrible, terrible model is more truthful, yes, more truthful than any other GPT out there.
So good to know. And the real sort of takeaway there is simply that the architecture, the infrastructure, the pipelines, if you will, in fact already exist for the kind of scenario that I'm projecting here. So what if in the end we're done in not by ICBMs or climate change, and not by microscopic pathogens or a mountain-sized meteor, but by text? Simple, plain, unadorned text, but in quantities so immense as to be all but unimaginable. A tsunami of text swept into a self-perpetuating cataract of content that makes it functionally impossible to reliably communicate in any digital setting. Not a brushed metal cyborg with body by Gold's Gym, but the alphabet, its constituent character sets, overwhelming filters, human attention, and whatever feeble mousetraps we might engineer to detect and delete it all. And perhaps this text-apocalyptic scenario is an exaggeration. Perhaps I'm being alarmist. Worst of all, perhaps I am indeed succumbing to the AI hype that we hear so much about on Twitter. But even if some of these particulars don't come to pass, I do think that our relationship to writing, again, writing as a kind of medial category, is about to change in some fundamental and fairly wrenching ways. Writing is going to become, I believe, writing, and more specifically text as the medial product of our writing, will become increasingly estranged from our own selves. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Bertram.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for inviting me to be part of this. Matt, that's so grim. Textpocalypse is so grim, but it does not seem entirely impossible. I guess I don't have any slides or anything, but I will say that I'm coming at this from a perspective as a writer, a creative writer, and a poet, with a track record of experience in making and working with computational systems to compose poetry and other writing. And the work that I have done largely predates ChatGPT. And I think maybe that's partly why ChatGPT is interesting to me, but maybe not as interesting as it could be. Because I've been working with large language models since around 2017. And so they have a lot of great uses, I think, but also some limitations. But most of what I do or have done has been to hard code poetry generators using the Python programming language, generating poems in P5.js. And like I said, I've been using and fine-tuning instances of GPT-2 since around 2017, 2018. And I've also done different kinds of smaller scale generative network building. So I've ultimately spent a lot of time with text generation over the past 5 years or so, not just LLMs, but with Markov chain generation and other kinds of neural networks for text generation. So it's something that I think a lot about from a creative standpoint in terms of like, how can this be a useful or interesting tool for a creative writer? And sometimes it is very interesting and sometimes it's not. So there are these, not everything that comes out of an LLM or ChatGPT is gold, I would say. And I've written and I've published poems and projects that I don't know if I would call them. Sorry, there's a cat that's coming up. This always happens. He's gonna step on the keyboard. Sorry. This is Ipo. So anyways, I've written and published poems and projects that I don't know if I'd call them necessarily collaborations with AI or LLMs, but works that have been spurred on by output from LLMs or works that receive like an assist from LLMs. And so I think when it comes to computational systems for text generation, I think there's some pretty compelling use cases when it comes to an artistic practice when used as a tool. And so in that sense, it's not unlike other innovative tools and methods that have assisted creative writers in the past. And in a lot of ways, it feels like for me as a writer, it's an outgrowth of some of the other kinds of techniques that I've employed in the past. I do think, like Matt mentioned, LLMs and ChatGPT, they represent this kind of maximalist approach to text generation, since it's so easy to create accretion, not necessarily content, because I don't think all content is content, right? Like you can just have text that isn't necessarily content. And so it functions based on accretion, right? Like just how much can you create in a single go round, let's say. And ChatGPT obviously works because of the oceanic amount of textual data that includes anything from pearls to absolute junk, as Matt's GPT 4chan is an example of. So again, from this creative writing standpoint and a poetic standpoint, when you use LLMs like GPT-2 and 3 and ChatGPT, they can generate uncanny, hallucinatory, and incantatory language that resembles or mimics or imitates the strongest works of postmodern and innovative poetry. And, you know, as a creative writer, that can be very compelling and very interesting. And especially when it is uncanny and oracular almost, right? I think there's pleasure for writers to lean into some of those outputs. But I also think like you can lean into those outputs with a very critical eye and a critical understanding and awareness of really what is going on under the hood, so to speak, of these LLMs. And since I've worked on fine tuning them, I have a bit of an understanding of how they work and how they can generate text. And in that sense, it's for me, they very much like they just generate text. But that they can produce language that resembles, mimics, or imitates very strong works, or what we might expect of a kind of postmodern or post-postmodern or post-human poetry. That it can imitate something that already exists doesn't mean that it brings something necessary to the newness of language or poetics, aside from knowledge of its composition. And so I think we're in an interesting space where knowledge of the composition of a work can become the most interesting thing about it. And that will lead me to sort of like another anecdote. So like ChatGPT can quote unquote write creatively, and it can generate a rather generic rhyming poem, but the times, you know, but it could also generate just like a lot of garbage. So the time spent curating its output, you know, can be spent just writing one's own work, like any other tool. And I think in the case of, you know, these questions of plagiarism, oftentimes the time a student spends, you know, plagiarizing an essay or paying someone to write an essay or doing anything other than trying to write the essay on their own can be just as much, if not more time, actually working on the project. So I'm intrigued by Matt's point about not being about sort of like this deep estrangement from writing itself. And what Matt didn't say, but said in our conversations about this panel, it raised a question of not being able to presume human agency and intentionality in the category of writing. And that I'm guessing can produce an estrangement from writing itself for the writer, the person who's using an LLM, but also for the reader who's doubly or triply estranged from the category of writing. So I agree that this is like a concerning and likely outcome from LLMs and ChatGPTs. While on the other hand, there are other kinds of minimalist computational systems that I feel can actually deepen involvement and understanding of writing. So I do want to make that point, that there are ways in which how you use the system, including LLMs, can actually provide an intimate experience with text as opposed to deep estrangement. But that's the difficult thing to do, and that requires like getting under the hood to really understand these models and understand what a corpus of text is when it's treated like data. Something I'm curious about as a creative writer is then to what extent writers will be called upon to prove or authenticate the human, Kitty, you stepped on the keyboard, authenticate the human agency part of their writing in ways that haven't been asked before, and make a distinction between what is human authored and what is machine authored. And so as an example, I've been working on an LLM project for a while now, in which I'm fine-tuning instances of GPT-2 and GPT-3. And I applied to just a regular writing residency to work on this project. And this is a kind of project that involves a lot of fine-tuning of the network and working with it and trying to get, let's say, like the best out of it. And it's work that is far more involved than just using something like going to ChatGPT, which is very simple. Right, when you fine-tune a network, it gets a bit more complicated. So this was a big name, well-known, prestigious writing residency, and I applied. And to their credit, they immediately circled back, asking in effect if I was using LLMs within the project, what about it was my original writing? And you know, the back and forth was like trying to discern for them what it was I was actually doing, and if what I was doing could be considered like a genuine or original creative act. And they also questioned whether or not I had explicit permission to train a neural network using a corpus of literary works, which I thought was very interesting. And that's because as I'm not sure that that's a question that's been asked of OpenAI and other LLM companies. I don't think we've heard about it, but it's interesting that they seem to think that the way I was using a literary corpus was something that I needed explicit permission to do, when I don't think we would encounter objections to what books we would bring to a writing residency that would inspire or that would inspire a project, or that we would incorporate into a project. There'd be an objection if we use that work and that content verbatim. But verbatim content is broadly not the output of LLMs, though it can be. And that's where, like, you have to kind of be careful and double check, right? Is it just returning verbatim output that's somewhere else on the internet? Of course, this puts it back to the authors, as it did before, not to plagiarize or use work that isn't their own IP. Consequently, I was not accepted to the residency, and I assume in part because the overall project and using LLMs in a creative way wasn't legible. And it's partly my fault that I couldn't make it legible, but they were very concerned with this aspect of proving that a certain percentage of the writing would be my own. What was me, what was the machine, and what was the point of a writing residency if I was going to have a machine do the writing, right? And the writing thus wouldn't be original. And so what they're not taking into account, and it's not their fault because explaining this is very kind of complicated in some ways, is like the work that goes into training and fine-tuning a network and really understanding it is a considerable amount of work, and making your own network from scratch can be seen as a creative enterprise because you are deeply involved with the text that you're using. So partly my fault that I probably couldn't explain it very well, through email and whatnot. But it was interesting, right? That this what if how is it original? How is it real writing? That sort of thing. And so I guess in any case, I find it a little ironic then that in the earlier history of computer-generated literature, people who submitted or created computer-generated work to traditional literary environments were often called upon to prove that it was a computer doing the work. And it wasn't just them, pulling words out of a bag, so to speak, and trying to imitate the supposed voice of the computer, which seems, I guess, strangely easy to imitate. Or there was at least an understanding in the past that there was such a thing as the voice of the computer, and that computer generated writing had to sound like it. That's a whole other question. And so again, it's ironic that that was sort of the past treatment of computer generated literature, and now I'm curious, and it remains to be seen, and I don't have the answer to this, that we might be facing the inverse, in which how creative writers might be called on to provide a kind of proof of work, right? That their writing isn't passing, right? That they're not passing off computer generated work as their own. And I think this will be interesting because it's thus, will we be seeing writers asked to authenticate their work and composition process in a way that has never been called upon before? Or in the past, I think, people wouldn't say like, well, can you authenticate how you wrote this sonnet in some kind of way? Show the process so that we know that it's not AI. We don't have answers to that. Those are just some kind of provocative questions I'm tossing out there, since I did sort of run into this question with the residency. So I do think, I share Matt's concerns and fears at the same time that I have a complex and somewhat ambivalent relationship to LLMs because I've worked so closely already with them. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Parham?
Hi, thanks. That was awesome. Both of those, thank you. I'm also trying to get my mind straight because, of course, I'm just here hanging out in the chat because we're getting so much awesome stuff directly to hosts and panelists. So I'm out here just begging people to share it with the audience, which is a long way of saying the whole earth needs to know about ChatGPT. Thank you. That's actually my talk. Now, let me actually start my timer, jokes aside. So I was thinking a lot, and I'm going to give a big disclaimer up front, given some of the things I'm about to say, because for me, the line between things I'm saying and things I'm thinking about, it kind of comes off the same, right? And so I'm going to be clear that what I'm thinking about right now in the context of today's event is just, coming out of a very specific moment of kinds of things I'm thinking about in general. And I'm also looking for ways, and I will not get there today, but thinking about ways of just disaggregating what we care about in which ways, right? So I'm thinking about, like, Matt's example earlier, and thinking about sort of like the institutional example of sending out, right, this GPT produced like moment that's supposed to be a moment of human sentiment, right, in a way that makes us feel. I'm also in this thinking about lost opportunity, and I have a feeling that Jess later to talk a bit more about this, so I'll kind of gloss it for a moment, then we can just continue in conversation. But thinking about sort of, the numerous ways in which when we're thinking about what Chat GPT can do, and I have to say already, I do use it. I'm already starting to use it in teaching. I use it in programming, not quite Chat GPT, but something very similar when I teach programming now already. So I'm thinking about these kinds of things. I'm just going to out myself as someone who is thinking about these things through use, not just because I'm thinking, which is going to matter in a second. So what I care about when I'm thinking about what Chat GPT can do at the level of writing, for the most part, and I think Lillian-Yvonne's example was really helpful for this, because I'm caring about process, right? And how does this dislocate or relocate where we imagine process might lie? I'm also thinking about process in terms of, in this case, lost opportunity. What are the stakes of any of us, not just students, losing opportunities to process, to make, to participate, and particularly in kind of small and fumbling ways, right? I highlight this because so much of the sort of going moment right now of talking about Chat GPT is sort of talking about like, gotcha. I told you it was stupid. This isn't very good, right? But it's difficult because technically the fumble is sort of what we want, because so often that's actually where we locate various sites of process and meaning. So there's already a sort of contradiction there that I don't have a way yet to parse, but it's on my mind. And again, kind of segueing back to the sort of disclaimer, it's really important to know that the technologies that we're talking about as Chat GPT and or et cetera, as large language models, we already use them. They're already using us, right? We're already been called and collected. It's happening actually constantly. We're talking about here, rightfully, in the context of writing and other kinds of sort of expressive production. But we also have to think about the ways in which the technology is driving models well beyond what we think of as writing. And in so doing helps us understanding how writing actually underlines models we think of as not being about writing, if that makes sense. So what I'm getting at here is like, writing at the end of the day is the world of policing, right? In legal description. It's the language of health, right? Oh my God, I'm thinking this moment actually. This is a few years ago when there were some changes in how, I don't know if many of you in the audience know this, but it's this kind of moment where suddenly we could access our own medical records online through these various portals and et cetera. And if you dig deeply enough, it turns out one of the things you can find are the doctor's comments about your visit. Right. So I have this weird, horrible reverse log of what I look like in pain, what I look like when I'm feeling optimistic, what I look like in all these things. But there was one that was really, I don't even know what it was, but I'm thinking of one, this access to a doctor's report in which the doctor described me as well-mannered and well-nourished. And I think a lot of that, I was like, dude, I don't know what to make of this. But I was thinking about part of the feeling of not knowing to do with that. Can't believe I share that. But part of not knowing what to do with that was also tied, of course, to my own long personal history of these complex relationships with medical establishments that have in various moments profoundly mistreated me, profoundly all the things, right? And so thinking about how in that moment of revelation, realizing that so much of this treatment and mistreatment is driven by a thing much larger by me or this doctor, right? Just those little moments of reminder, to be clear, is all I'm getting at. And I'm also thinking here about, and circling back a little bit to Matt, and thinking about the tsunami of text, right? And the ways in which we may or may not end up sort of destroyed by text, right? Could it be the robots? Will it be the climate? I'm doing a bad version of your point. Or will it just be text, right? But we also know how little text it takes to bring down communities, to encourage violence, right? To get all kinds of other inactions upon the social sort of done, right? That's a bad sentence, but you know what I mean, right? And so in thinking about this, we're not just thinking about scale, which is part of what you're getting at, but we also have to think about temporality. If nothing else, what does indeed terrify me about thinking about LLMs and its use in ChatGPT is somewhat less even than the scale sometimes. 'Cause again, we're constantly being called and collected. It's sort of the work of the social, it's the work of the nation, it's the work of all these different kinds of establishments. But the speed is what gets me and terrifies me, right? Which I can say more about in conversation. On the optimistic side, though, I can also say in some of the sidebar, I can also say that I'm somewhat heartened by the extent to which we're all enamored about whether or not the sort of outputs of ChatGPT's system reckons, sort of are recognizable of sentience, right? If they're recognizable as a kind of humankind, if they're recognizable, right, as something that brings us closer to this idea of the human. And I'm like, yo, humanities, like this is our big break. Like we have a whole lot of people out here, in pop culture, sort of newly ready to, believe or explore the extent to which language and expressivities are at the core of the very idea of being. Right? I want to take this as a win, but I have a sneaking suspicion that's going to be hard, right? I'm just laughing at the comments in the chat as well, right? How do we take this as a win? And I'm like, indeed, it really is about what it means to be human, right? And so how do we sort of like parlay that moving forward? That said, I'm also kind of interested, though, going back to my previous point about the numerous ways in which ChatGPT gives us insight as well, again, into other kinds of interpretive work, right? Other moments and kinds of interpretation. And with that, thinking as well about so much of what we think of as different kinds of expressive registers, the song, sound, image, etc. In many ways, and we know this, there's whole fields of study, and we know about this, that really tie us back to thinking about the role of text and of language in all of this. And so as an example, just trying to think this through a little bit, because our time is short and my time is wrapping up, I was thinking a little bit about Dolly. So if you all don't know Dolly, this is a software that works explicitly, I'll paste it in the chat, that works explicitly on sort of linguistic representations of images, right? So it's really important that even though we talk about something like Dolly, it's like, so I say, I made one, it was like, stage me a claymation encounter between a cat and an avocado, right? And it can do it, right? But there was a way in which also every term in that sentence, cat, avocado, et cetera, particularly cat, almost anytime you put cat into a single session of Dolly, you're kind of always going to get the same image of a cat. It's cat, qua, cat. It's a black cat, white socks, white tail. It is cat, right? And so when thinking about this, of course, this offers us insight as well into thinking about the numerous ways in which so much of our social and so much of our worlds, of course, already runs on stereotype. This is like a duh, but I highlight it when put in juxtaposition to the previous points, one that Matt was making about scale, and I want to add to this about speed, right? Stereotype at speed and scale is a site of terror, right? And at the same time, I was also thinking through this, and I was thinking, Dolly, I said, create me an image of Black children playing alongside a lake. I'm from Chicago. I have lots of images of Black children playing alongside lakes in my own mind. But in those pictures, it's very interesting how so much of this, right, really comes down to the numerous ways that like the Black children will always look somewhat similar. They're adorable, they're brown, the girls almost always have puffs, et cetera, right? It's difficult at the same time to imagine this as no different from the numerous moments in recent years. And Sophia Noble points us to this, the numerous moments when, you Google Black people and you get back images of apes. The horrifying thing is to imagine that these might be the same moment, no matter how beautifully couched it is in the latter or in the former example, right? And so when I try to myself then, coming after this, imagine myself or ask myself to imagine Black children playing alongside a lake, I'm noticing that my mind kind of seizes up, right? Because I'm seizing up with this request, the call to database, Imagine Black children playing alongside a lake, right? There's a way in which this potentially, as the example I just gave, brings forth an image that's no different than the stereotypical images that I just named. At the same time, the moment of the rise of that more stereotypical image coming out of my experience with Dolly makes me also understand that the very idea of the request, the act of the request, also produces the material conditions for something that seems to work against my own process, that works against memory, that works against experience, right? And so thinking about this, I can't believe I'm doing this, but we need to go back to our second and third order simulacra somewhat and to sort of get through this. Because I'm thinking, and I'm glad in the chat, stochastic parents is coming up as well. I want to read a few quotes as I wrap up and thinking about this, right? Right. On the one hand, I love the idea as a tool. I love the idea of what we can do. On the other hand, going back to our idea of third order simulacra, I'm thinking how in the stochastic parrots paper, we get this quote, the first one, an LLM is a system for haphazardly stitching together sequences of linguistic forms observed in the vast training data, according to probabilistic information about how they combine, without any reference to meaning. A stochastic parrot, if you go back to the 4chan example of it being the most truthful representation of X, right? That gets us towards this notion of one person's imagination, the probabilistic, right? The probabilistic itself is a vision of violence. Finally, in thinking about this, another quote to sort of close with and thinking about this, and I thought it was really, really interesting, is that the stochastic parrots paper asks us to think about the numerous ways, as we know, so much human communication is actually relational, interrelational, and what's lost, again, through the speed with the moment of relationality, right? And talking about what it calls human-to-human communication work, right? It talks about how in moments of communication, quote, we build a partial model of who they are and what common ground we think they share with us, right? With any given audience. We interpret, and the interpret is active, it's constant, and changes millisecond to millisecond. And that's in fact how we make meaning, not with just the landing of words. But there's a small section in the paper, and I'll end with this, that talks about the numerous ways that the training data itself is unfathomable. I think the section is literally called Unfathomable Training Data. And it highlights some of the difficulty of which we speak. It's indeed unfathomable because it's so large, but it's also absolutely unfathomable because it's not us, but made of us. It's us without the relation, it's us without the modulation, it's us without the check and without the balances, right? The LLM is grounded in the possibility of gathering everything without the kinds of relational work and process that makes us, and I'm speaking this particularly from an African-American perspective, without the kinds of relational work that makes us possible to sort of name, to identify and ride, and frankly, to otherwise survive what is in fact a large training data set of life that is absolutely unfathomable without the tools with which to navigate it. What's at stake in losing those tools? What's at stake in handing over those tools? And what's at stake in always forgetting the ways in which human language is always going to be so much more. Now, as a platitude, we're so much more than the machines, but that human language is in fact something far less programmatic than what we imagine it to be. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Marissa. Well, I just want to thank everyone for having me. This has just already been a fascinating conversation, and I was a little worried there wouldn't be very many overlaps with what I was about to say as a writing program director, but there will be, I think. So I'm excited to to have my little section and then to hear how we can all draw lines between all of these things. So as Scott noted, I direct the academic writing program at UMD, which supports 60 instructors teaching over 2,000 students per semester here in 120 sections of English 101 each term. So I spent a great deal of time thinking about how to teach writing. And I entered this conversation with a few pedagogical responses to ChatGPT. But before I move on with my comments, I want to thank the members of my program's administrative team, especially Erin Green, who's helped me kind of think through what to chat with you all about. As well as the members of the writing committee, including the directors of our other writing programs, Veselova Gacharska, who's directing the Writing Center, and Scott Weibel, directing the professional writing program. We've also been meeting with UMD Gen Ed directors and Bill Cohen, our associate dean, to talk about ChatGPT, and attending UMD's Teaching and Learning Transformation Center meeting. So to say it, and to sum it up, I've been up to a lot of ChatGPT discussions about what are we going to do with undergraduate teaching and learning. And I appreciate having this other opportunity to think this through. So throughout all of these conversations, teachers like me have been trying to make sense of and negotiate the onslaught of articles. Oops, let's see if yeah, here we go. The onslaught of articles, news programs, webinars, and podcasts predicting how ChatGPT will radically or not change perceptions of writing writ large. More particularly, we've been thinking about how ChatGPT will alter the work we and our students do in our writing classes and in other classes around the university. As director of our very large Gen Ed program, I've been asked, what is your response to ChatGPT? What are your guidelines and policies? Should we police this? And if so, how? How will we teach writing? And what will students learn? And there's so much to think about within this conversation, and it seems to change by the second or minute, especially given the speed by which this technology emerged on the scene right before our winter break, not giving us a minute to even catch our breaths in late November 2022. So reports are finding that teachers are rightly feeling threatened, overwhelmed, confused, and anxious. And I want to say that these emotions feel even more heavy to me, given all the change and trial that we just went through with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We just went through a major pedagogical upheaval, and ChatGPT feels like I had another wave in my notes today, but Matt and Marissa have both used the word tsunami, which is pretty close to what it feels like some of us are experiencing. So it's just another tsunami to hit the shore. So stressed teachers out there, I feel you. This is a lot. It's been a lot to kind of wrap our minds around. So as I've been listening into this conversation, there have been a number of suggestions as to how writing teachers should respond to ChatGPT, from ban it to use it. And banning seems like an impossible and frankly less interesting option for us as teachers. And as I've been learning how people are using ChatGPT in the classroom, there are some compelling and innovative pedagogical ideas. And here are some that our administrative fellow, Erin Green, has identified. I hope Erin's here to get this shout out for all, sorry, excuse me, just one second. I didn't mean to change my slide, for all their work on this topic. So let's overtly talk with our students about ChatGPT as a composing tool, thinking with students about such questions as what can it do and what can it do? What are its affordances and limitations? When is it useful and where does it fall short? How does AI writing introduce new questions about ethics, authorship, invention, and collaboration? How is AI writing replicating or not replicating dominant paradigms, and where are opportunities for feminist, queer, anti-racist, and decolonial critique? And how is AI writing changing their relationship to writing and learning? So here I'm seeing some echoes with the other speakers at our panel. We might also invite students to use ChatGPT for its brainstorming and heuristic potential, and students could start their composing process by using ChatGPT and asking the bot to offer research questions on the topic. And students might use it to gain a sense of the challenges to their claims in their writing. So ChatGPT could be a place for identification and generation of counterarguments that students should address in their writing. So I'm sure there's many more good ideas like the ones Erin offered here. And my program will have a roundtable on productive uses of ChatGPT probably later in March and early April. But what I would like to center attention on, though, is a slightly different approach, one that brings me back to some foundational understandings regarding effective pedagogy that scholars and teachers in rhetoric and writing studies have been thinking about for over 50 years, or we could kind of go back all the way to Aristotle if we wanted to. So, and this is just like a brief and kind of embarrassingly short list of some of the writing that, some of the scholarship that I wanted to point our attention to. So I want to suggest that as we get our feet under us and assess this new situation, we can double down on what teachers of writing already do and do well. And that is centering pedagogies based in writing and learning processes and creating rich opportunities for students' reflective writing. We know that ChatGPT can create an essay product. It can't, though, it seems to me yet, do a lot of the human aspects that attend to writing. And here I'm hearing echoes with Lillian-Yvonne and Marissa's comments. So it can't articulate emotions, it can't assess and prioritize sources as well as we imagine it might be able to. So instead of valuing the product of our students' writing, which brings us back into the teeth of ChatGPT, let's redouble our investments in students' writing and thinking processes. And let's do this especially by integrating reflective writing into our curricula. So in our program at UMD, we've conducted 2 studies on student reflection, one published in College Composition and Communication in 2018, and another forthcoming in that same journal in 2023. In both studies, we examined students' responses to reflective prompts that instructors in our program use to break down students' research and writing processes. So through prompts like these, we use reflection to center the living, breathing, and feeling student writer and invite them to think deeply about how they're taking up writing tasks and moving through their writing processes. These pedagogies help students gain insight on what and how they're learning, how they're forming arguments, and the ways they're revising their points of view given encounters with new ideas, people, and evidence. These opportunities for reflection make visible students' research and thinking processes as they use reflection to reconsider with us, with their teachers, what they have learned and the ways this new information has catalyzed different thinking for them as composers. So through reflection, students can articulate for us how and what they're learning as they write. And such pedagogical work builds on the Association for Writing Across a Curriculum's response to AI writing, as this organization reminds us about the critical value of composing. Put simply, we write to learn, or as they note, rather than writing simply being a matter of presenting existing information or furnishing products for the purposes of testing or grading, writing is a fundamental means to create deep learning and foster cognitive development. So I want to close my comments today by sharing with you an example of the kinds of reflection we're hoping to build into our syllabus at UMD in more robust ways. And I wanted to kind of center some student voices in here because I think it's important to see what really interesting and invigorating student writing and composing can look like. So here, I'm just going to show, do I have time, Tita? It's like 2 minutes. So here I wanted to center a multimodal reflection by a student at Maryland, Madeline Lessard. And in this piece, she reflects on the research and composing process she employed as she worked on her multimodal inquiry presentation, which is one assignment in our first year writing sequence.
Hi everyone, I'm Madeline, and this is just a quick overview of how I made my inquiry video on social media and political polarization. First, I started to go about this by narrowing down my idea. I wanted to do a social science topic, so I listed out some broad ones like political polarization, misinformation in the media, and a few others. Once I had this list, then I thought of specific questions within each topic to find one narrow enough I could cover as thoroughly in a single semester. For example, for political polarization, what actions could reduce polarization? What's driving it? Is it the media in general? Social media? Ultimately, I picked the last one because I thought it was both interesting and small enough to cover fully. After choosing my question, then I started preliminary research. First, I just listed places that I would be able to find sources, mostly academic databases, but also internet sources and a few relevant ones I'd already read, like a popular psychology book, a podcast episode, and a few articles from a different class I was also taking at the time. While using the databases, I narrowed down the search results and read through a bunch of abstracts to find 5 relevant papers for my bibliography first. This also definitely helped me start seeing the general schools of opinion on my topic. I also found internet sources good for getting perspectives that took more real-life factors into account, as well as for getting general background information. By this point, my research notes were getting pretty messy. I'd found 3 broad categories of opinion on whether or not social media affects polarization: yes, no, and indirectly. So I started organizing my notes around those categories. I also found that organizing around stasis theory was useful. I had a cause and effect question, so I wanted to make sure that I had clear facts and definitions that introduced the topic well. Finally, I also found that ordering my ideas large to small generally helped make my video have a clear structure. And then I also found that watching other people's videos was a really good place for getting ideas as well. After organizing my notes, I finally started a draft and started to be more brutal with cutting out non-essential information. I personally always overwrite my first drafts, so reminding myself that I didn't have to have a full answer yet definitely helped a lot with keeping my video shorter and focused. Having the general structure already established in an outline format also helped me a lot. Once the draft existed, finally I made PowerPoint slides to fit it. I split up my script's major points by highlighting them in different colors, like you see on the screen. When making my video later, this also made it easier to know where to transition slides. I aimed for one major visual per highlighted point, and I used mostly images with minimal text to make it easier for viewers. Finally, once I'd finalized my script and slides and practiced them, I recorded myself reading the script directly with voice notes on my phone. I downloaded PDF versions of the slides, and then I uploaded those and the audio file to iMovie. Finally, I overlaid the slides with the audio using the highlighted script to know where to transition. I double checked everything, exported the final video, and then I submitted it. Anyway, this was just my.
So thank you for watching a little bit about the students' reflection. I hope that we're seeing here something that I don't think ChatGPT can produce yet. Through this reflection, we see how one student composer is becoming a knowledge builder and a unique human communicator, and the process that's leading him to that communication. So thank you.
Thank you so much. What a lovely and as Professor Enoch just pointed out, richly connected, I think, series of reflections. And just to maybe notice one thing and then invite the panelists to begin to talk to each other if they'd like. It just struck me, ending where we did with Madeline Lessard's reflection, right? That we might see that as doing a kind of proof of work. I mean, I suppose Sangeeta Ray put in the comments that there's a kind of presumptive plagiarism that connects to what Lillian-Yvonne was describing, right? The kind of the carceral or sort of more negative dimensions of what it entails for writers to prove and to kind of introduce human agency into their work. I just wanted to maybe plug Madeline Lessard into what Lillian-Yvonne was describing in terms of that proof of work, but perhaps is one potential thread, but also just invite panelists to take a moment to reflect on, as you've already done, on what others have said.
I'll jump in. That was a beautiful place to end. I think my colleague Lillian-Yvonne described my scenario as pessimistic or dark, and I mean it is. But again, I think we also kind of have to think through these questions not just from the vantage point of academic writing, say, or creative writing, but from sort of the realities of where the media and culture industries are today. And I think about the kind of writing that our students are most likely going to be doing once they graduate and end up in different employment situations. And I think back to, again, the Guillory piece on the memo. I think back to the doctor's reports that we all now access through patient portals. I think back to the kind of sort of institutional faff that the Vanderbilt episode represented, where arguably the only thing anomalous about what happened in that instance was that they said the quiet part out loud. And there's a sense in which writing has already, again, writing as a kind of medial category has been evacuated of so much of those fundamentals of affect, relationality, human expression that we've been talking about. I don't have this, I don't have the solution to that. I don't have the answer, but I do think we sort of need to acknowledge what writing actually is and how it performs in our institutions, in our environments today.
Well, it's difficult, if I could jump in for a second, too, something about what you just said. Matt sort of pulled a thing together without us being like this. What I try to avoid is always going, this is just like this, and this is just like this, because history, right? At the same time, we do know patterns emerge, and trying to think of sensitive ways of rethinking that. And in this, thinking so much and thinking about Sangeeta Ray's point as well. I mean, historically, writing has been used, one of the boundaries cases around who gets to count as human, who counts as valuable, who's allowed to vote, who's allowed to be recognized, right, as a person, and et cetera, right? So I'm just thinking back, kind of Phyllis Wheatley, let's go old school for a sort of moment of like, oh no, they can write. We might need to rethink some things. Oh no, never mind, we're good, because this writing is just parroting other forms that she's seen, right? So there's a way in which, because we can't win, right, from this perspective, all we can take from this, not all we can take, but one thing we can take from this and thinking about the sort of even presumptive plagiarism is that presumptive plagiarism, and I hear it already, I won't name sort of conversations, but I hear it already in talking to professors, this presumptive plagiarism idea, of course, lands harder on certain populations. Of course, lands harder is yet another way. Scott, a term you used as you were talking, since it's like the carceral state, right? And what's at stake in imagining, therefore, that the engagement of the system is a reproduction of carcerality, but that also the fact that it exists in some ways also becomes a way of even taking away some of the recognitions that over time have come to people through engaging in this, you know, for many ways, corrupt system of anti-Black racism, but at the same time also have persevered through it. It's crazy. That's my it's crazy.
Well, please, of course, panelists, continue as you like to, as we work through some of the questions, to just take a moment to respond to each other. There's so many rich and suggestive questions that we're receiving that I thought it might help to yoke together a few of them. And, you know, so I'm going to read 3 questions that are kind of, I might loosely yoke together. And they all, I think, in some ways come out of, well, especially the first two from Carrie Krauss and Matt Griffin, come out of a kind of response to Dr. Bertram's description of the residency anecdote. And then I think that the third one that I'll read from Leonardo Flores kind of connects in a broader way to, I guess, what we might call backlash or reactionary sort of elements of what's happening in the conversation. So Carrie Krauss asks, Dr. Bertram's residency anecdote concerns me. It has the potential to further isolate computer-generated poetry from poetry more broadly, restricting its publication to e-lit venues and thus sequestering it, which I find misguided and regrettable. I'd love to see more traditional creative writing outlets receptive to computational verse so that the two aren't wholly decoupled from each other. Matt Griffin's thought is Dr. Bertram's residency anecdote concerns me as well. It has the potential to further. Oops! Of course, I'm reading Carrie's again because I mistyped it. Let me find Matt's. So let's see here. Pardon me, everybody. Let me go straight to Leonardo Flores, and then I'll gather my notes. So Leonardo Flores asks, as someone who studies and creates electronic literature, I'm concerned that the moral panic around ChatGPT and people trying to exploit it to mass-produce writing for creative writing publications will cause a backlash and bias against computational writing, the oldest genre of electronic literature. What do you think we can do to prevent or counteract this? So, you know, I guess I would invite Lillian-Yvonne, Matt, anyone else, the panelists who might want to talk about this backlash, this kind of reactionary dimension to the discourse.
Yeah, I think those are really great questions, and I also see Matt's question in the Q&A about, like, will there be a role frame up around the craft of training, prompt engineering, and producing output that speaks to the care and attention. The short answer is, like, there already is. Prompt engineering is already like a field of its own. I think, like, part of the backlash that I've seen and that I'm seeing is, it's like, in and of itself, right? ChatGPT and the LLMs, well, one would like to believe they're not insidious. They only do things when they're prompted to do things. And so I know there was an article, I think, in maybe it's the Washington Post about the magazine Clarkesworld getting inundated with just, you know, ChatGPT written science fiction stories. And so, like, the problem there isn't ChatGPT. It's the people who are like, I'm going to use ChatGPT to generate a story to submit to a magazine that pays money, right? So like, that's, you know, does it just encourage bad actors? Quite possibly, right? And that's you know, it's always going to be hard to dissuade bad actors from taking advantage of a particular kind of environment that might enable them to make some quick money with little effort, right? You know, same thing, you know, people like buying a whole bunch of hand sanitizer at the start of the pandemic, right? There's always going to be a bad actor who's like, Amazon, you know, is evil, but like the selling something in and of itself, right? But the way in which you do it and what you're trying to do with it is different. I do think, like, this idea of, will it further isolate electronic literature? I think so. I think that is a concern because, and to Leo's point as well, I also think that there's in the case of this residency too, I think there was a genuine misunderstanding around what you can do with an LLM and how you can work with an LLM. And so something like ChatGPT, I mean, I also have to think about like, why was ChatGPT released to the public? Is it, you know, like who stands the most to gain from that? Is it generating more text to be used, right, in an LLM, or is it piloting something that will eventually, and already, of course, they release their API, so you will have to pay for it, right? Who stands the most to gain from that? Versus like thinking through how to create a language model on your own and building it, and the outcome of that, and treating that as literature. So I think like there's some genuine worry there. I don't know how, like, what we can do around that, because, you know, there's a question, right? Like how much, what are some of, there are real differences between using ChatGPT to write a poem and hard coding computation to write a poem and work and things like that. That's actually very different. I wouldn't call that AI. I wouldn't call hard coding a poem, you know, a generator in Python AI. I think those are two different things that are confusingly conflated and problematically conflated, right? And I even think LLMs calling them AI is potentially problematically conflating what we understand about those things. So I do worry it will cordon things off, because it's just like, well, you know, electronic literature, ELIT is AI lit. It's, you know, it's a ChatGPT, and that's really not the case. There are all these different, you know, there's many different varieties of ELIT and approaching generated text as there are regular texts and regular genres. So I think is an issue. I don't know how we sort of solve that problem right now. So I'm just going to agree with agree that it's an issue.
Well, let me ask a question that I think Nika Mavrodi raised first, and Jim McLaughlin followed up on it, and this is in the chat actually. So the question is there a place for non-native speakers in this conversation? Jim McLaughlin follows up, knowing how much time could be spent on mechanical usage issues when working with ESL writers, I am torn when considering that a paper could be run through ChatGPT to allow for faculty to give more consideration of higher order questions in the writing of ESL students. And then there's a related question from Annette V about how LLM-driven writing will affect non-English writing, the writing of non-native English speakers, or the writing of those with little academic training in writing. So just to invite Professor Enoch or others to comment on that sort of series of ideas.
Thanks, Scott. I was really hoping we'd get a chance to talk about this, and Shyam Sharma just put a note in here as well in terms of language injustices. I mean, my comment here, or short, is that I see this as a very interesting conversation to be having, as arguments for linguistic justice are happening in like vibrant and really innovative ways within rhetoric and writing studies, and really arguing for the private sector, the public sector, the academia to invite students to write from their language backgrounds. And then we're getting this way for academic like language ease to, you know, fix our students' writing so it all looks like standard English, which is really white coded language. And so it's deeply troubling to me that this is kind of going to be a fix, although you can see why students would be tempted. And I have heard that faculty across different disciplines are saying, you know, this is an opportunity for students not to have to wrestle with their writing. It's also a way to erase cultural backgrounds of students and the linguistic forms that they operate in. And so I think it's a really big conversation for us to have as to that this can just kind of fix up students' writing and colleagues' writing and our own writing. And I think we have to really we have fabulous scholars in our own department, like Cecilia Shelton, who can really speak to this and are authoritatively about, you know, what do these connections, how do we mine these connections and think them through? And that's a good one. Chat. I don't know the answer to that one, but that's a good one. I haven't, no.
I just wanted to also kind of put a sort of middle ground out there, and I'm thinking back a little bit to some of the work that I've done on the history of word processing, for example. I mean, it's fascinating to me how many of these same anxieties were circulating in the early 1980s, say, when personal computers became a thing. And this goes back again to some of Lillian-Yvonne's comments, but you can, if you go back and sort of dig out paperbacks from the 1980s, you can find authors' notes talking about their first word processor, and then including kind of reassurance to the reader that the computer didn't write the novel, right? And so, in some sense, these are not new conversations, but I think what is sort of what we're rapidly sliding into, and this is perhaps the most likely text-apocalyptic scenario, is simply one where these tools and technologies become invisibly integrated into our everyday writing environments. Just like nowadays, we expect things like spell check and grammar check, and we're all used to autocomplete on our phones. We're also already seeing there's a beta for Office 365 that has ChatGPT integrated into the interface, if you will, so that as you're writing, whether it's a student paper or anything else, you are also receiving paragraphed and larger sized suggestions for what for how the text can develop. And I don't think there's any turning away from that or putting that particular genie back into the bottle. I think this kind of hybrid writing, patch writing, is absolutely going to become the norm, and very, very soon. And so in some sense, the whole question of whether it was either a person or a language model that wrote this particular thing, in some sense, it's going to also become a moot question, because the answer will almost always invariably be both and.
I might pose a question from James Perlow that I think in some ways follows on from what Professor Kirschenbaum just said, and but it just sort of gets to the question of how to make and remake and unmake, and what Professor Parham was talking about in her talk, how to change and sort of reimagine, right, writing in these sort of LLM contexts. So James Perla asks, I'm interested in how administrative writing, like the memo, and non-academic writing as a place of discursive violence. This picks up on Professor Parham's point around temporality and the layering of stereotype. Once things get to a certain scale of writing on top of writing, how does one intervene in the reproduction of the normative? Or does the sound of dissent, alternative possibilities, get drowned out in the noise of the normative that becomes overrepresented and reinforced in popular discourse? Perhaps this is always the challenge, just at a different scale.
Yeah. So I'm slow reading. Oh, I took my glasses off. I think that's so well put. And it's something that we have to be thinking about all the time. The sentence, I'm just repeating the question, I know, but administrative writing as a place of discursive violence, absolutely. I mean, these are the spaces when you're talking about all kinds of people, but particularly sort of women, people of color, we're kind of talking about the sort of constant violence of your daily work life. This is one of those spaces and places, right? And so there's a way in which, again, it's not always the big, large scale phenomena. It's often the small daily things and what you're talking about, right? It's really about the small and daily, right? So I'm curious to think about the sort of corrosive effects of these small things, right? And thinking about also once things get to, I'm reading again, once things get to a certain scale of writing on top of writing, that's going back to the second and third order thing, losing the reference point, right? Which seems like a easy to say thing now. We've all come through and back again at various moments of thinking about different kinds of postmodernity. But there's a way in which, if on the one hand, we think about this sense of writing on top of writing, And then we also think of all the various kinds of historical strategies, people have come up with to deal with the idea of yourself as an illusion and the ways in which you have to work through the social idea of you as an illusion versus who you really are. This is double consciousness. This is Baldwin, for instance, talking about how everyone has a version of themselves who's out there being, kind of constructed by the social. And part of living is learning how to navigate between who you are and who the society tells you to be. So there's a way in which, on the one hand, we also know there's so many positive strategies, not positive, but effective strategies that come out of your question. But something else I'm hearing in your question, James, is this sense of, of getting drowned out in the noise, right? And that's when the scale thing begins to matter again. I'm thinking about, some of the stuff I teach on, like bots and Gamergate and et cetera. Part of what happens is not so much that these bots are repeating all this kind of shot news, right? All this kind of bullshit, is that the sheer volume of the activity begins to make people imagine that more people believe certain things than might actually be the case. And what do you do against that feeling? What do you do against that flood? How do you choose not to drown? And so the idea that we're producing yet another tool that many ways enables the kind of drowning effect is indeed discouraging. I thought my point was to end positively, but I didn't get there, so I'll stop.
Thanks. So please, I also would invite panelists as they see the different questions come in to jump in and take one up, because we only have about 7 minutes left. But one, I'd love to come back to Professor Kirschenbaum's. So this is a question from Joanna Rogers, who asks, I was particularly struck by Matt's use of the framework of a political economy to think about issues related to automated text generation using LLMs. I wonder if Matt could talk a bit more about what he includes and or excludes from that framework.
Yeah. So I don't know that I'm intentionally including or excluding any particular variables, if you will. Again, my instincts, based on my own training, were to sort of approach the question through a kind of media studies framework, thinking on the one hand about the sort of materialities of writing right now, which certainly includes essentially the dematerialization of writing as what I've called a bit stream, but also very much the way in which, as I was discussing, writing is commodified under the category of content, which then becomes monetized on the internet. Certainly, I'm thinking, for example, of Shoshana Zuboff's work on surveillance capitalism here and the way that content circulates online. Doubtless, there are other frameworks and considerations. Those were the two that I sort of went to initially. I absolutely, my own training is also as an English professor, and I absolutely sort of want to hold out places for those reservoirs of humanity in that which we write, and not just reduce all of writing or all textual content on the internet to content. Nonetheless, and we know that nobody has the internet has never not outperformed our own worst expectations of it, and in that sense, I do want to try to reckon with this notion of what it will mean when that which is written becomes a kind of fundamentally, if you will, as I said, estranged category. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's just a little bit more of my own sort of thought process in terms of how I got to that particular scenario.
Thanks. And maybe I'll pose one from Dylan Lewis, who asks us to consider the public humanities. I'm interested, Dylan says, in thinking about the public humanities opportunities offered prompted by the occasion of ChatGPT, what should we be doing publicly as educators to be informing the public of what LLMs are and how they affect what we do here at the university as researchers, writers, poets, and teachers? I'm thinking of Professor Parham, sort of we're doubling down on the value of the humanities is part of it, right? But wondering if you have further thoughts, or if others have thoughts on that.
I mean, I think like demystifying it is a good start, because I think part of why it's like gripped the public imagination so much, and you know, is like the media hype train, right? Like the clickbait, you know, this robot has just written your article, are we doomed, da da da, you know, kind of thing. And it's like, you know, without fully understanding that like what people are calling artificial intelligence, and what is it versus like the media image we have of it, that we've had of it for the past 50, 60, or 70 years, as this like disembodied like human double with an uber brain that can just like control everything and think of everything and have the answer to everything. I think like something that we can try to do is to bring it down to size, and it's into what it like really is. Like, you know, we have predictive text on our phones when we send a text. And that's a very, I know Marissa mentioned like LLMs are already using us, and we've been using them. And we have, you know, ChatGPT in some ways is an extremely sophisticated text generated, like, you know, text generating network. It's a predictive text, you know, like a super large, complicated thing in your iPhone, right? So like what it does is it scoops up all this text, and it literally does treat it as data. The network assigns everything a number in a multi-dimensional space, and then analyzes the relationships between tokens, which are words or parts of words, and uses, and this is all in this like cloud space, right? It's all in this virtual space, and that's how it does what it does. You know, I think like the media presents it almost as like it is a strange thinking being, a la Walter or David from like the Alien movies, that, you know, that we can't, you know, in a lot of ways, like researchers don't fully understand how they work, but it is not something that operates like on its own without a kind of, you know, without programming and without human intervention. So I think like finding a way to right size it and break it down to what it actually is, I think could be really useful, right? So that people aren't thinking of it as like the omnipresent mother, you know, on a spaceship or something like that. I think that could potentially be useful.
That's really striking. And I think yes, yes, and yes. And I love the word you use also, just that demystification, and bringing something, it's not quite a pun, but maybe like bringing down to size, like how willing we are to hand over to this imagination of this thing that's bigger than us, right? And what I hear in this sense of the sense of the thing that's bigger than us is also anxiety, right? It may be that simple, right? Simple in huge quote marks, obviously. But if you go back, and Lillian-Yvonne, I think you're evoking this as well, of thinking back on this last 50 or 60 years of sort of science fiction and engineering writing around on the representation of alternate sentience and intelligence, right? Thinking about, so what I'm thinking about, I'll go quickly just to make it make sense, is that on some level, I've been thinking a little bit less, true confession, about how ChatGPT is going to change the writing of English necessarily. And I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which the moments when different kinds of ChatGPT and equivalent programs for coding came out, and suddenly you're seeing all these software engineers immediately lose their jobs, right? Even when we're talking about memos, we're talking about coding, the kinds of writing that Matt and others were just talking about previously. What we're talking about also, the anxiety about people losing their livelihoods, right? There's a way in which that content machine, we know, is thousands of people who are cultural workers, right? Copy editor by day, writer by night, you know, the whole sort of thing. And so if there's a way to sort of identify from a public humanities perspective, better ways to identify and offer strategies for sort of diffusing the anxiety, or not diffusing it, it's correct, but naming it properly, that might help push through some of this conversation. You know, I teach a class and have for a long time that sort of maps, you might hear it in my comments, that maps sort of legacies of enslavement and racial passing against, you know, sort of the rise of the robots, right? And what you see repeatedly, if you're looking over that long history, we begin to see why almost every kind of 50s, 60s, Asimov robot story is ultimately also a slave narrative. It's not because they're just the same, it's because the material conditions under which their labor is managed and controlled carries a lot of similarities. And so in thinking about these anxieties, right, we actually do know that from a literary and cultural perspective, we have multiple in routes into thinking about this, but we have to also find ways to sort of even catch people's attention, because going back even to the idea of the tsunami, we're dealing with the kind of media enterprise right now that's moving in such big ways that it is difficult to nail down the entry point for those conversations. But yeah, we'll figure it out.
Well, on that note, we're out of time, and I just want to again thank the speakers for this wonderful conversation. I've learned so much, and we'll make the recording publicly available. We'll make the comments in the chat available. Thank you to the audience for the suggestive and rich questions, and have a good day, everyone. Thanks.